This episode is brought to you by AMC and AMC Plus, presenting the critically acclaimed Anne Rice's Interview with the Vampire, praised as one of TV's best shows of the decade by the Chicago Tribune, starring Jacob Andersen, Sam Reed, and Delaney Hales. For your Emmy consideration in all categories, go to amcnfyc.com for more.
So first of all, nobody's ever made a bad show in Hollywood. No writer has ever worked on a bad show. And it's always like, well, if you could read the scripts.
Welcome back to Hollywood Stories, Tales of Television, Season 2. Today we've got a great guest I'm really excited to talk to, someone I've been wanting to talk to and meet for a very long time. There are people in Hollywood who, whenever you hear about a cool project or a cool thing happening, or their names are associated with it. And our guest today, Nell Scovell, is one of those people who's just attached to so many great things and been part of so many great things and done so many great things. I know her work dating back before her Hollywood career, even when she was writing for the legendary Spy magazine in the 1980s, and she was doing fantastic work then. And since then, she has been a part of an incredible list of shows, including It's Gary Shandling's show, Newhart, The Simpsons, Coach, The Critic. She is the creator of Sabrina the Teenage Witch. The list goes on. And just every time you see her, she is insightful and funny. And I wanted to just talk to her about this career in television and also, as comes up in our conversation, what it was like being a trailblazer, a woman working in comedy TV at a time where there were very, very few, which is a topic that she deals with in her book, Just the Funny Parts, which is a fantastic, one of the best memoirs of working in television I think I've ever read, and is hilarious and funny. I can't recommend it enough. So we sat down and we had a talk about this amazing career and what it was like to be a trailblazer, as she is. So let's get on with it. Welcome our guest, Nell Scovell. Writer, director, creator. Do you have one title above all that something you have? I'm referring to Nell Scovell, our guest today.
Hello. Culturally, I think I'm supposed to say mom is the title I prefer above all else. But showrunner, that's the most fun.
Yeah. That is a very august title. Nell's work has strung through so many great Hollywood classics and great Hollywood moments, from It's Gary Shandling's show to Late Night with David Letterman to The Simpsons, where she's written a classic episode, to Coach, to creating Sabrina the Teenage Witch, and on and on and on. And we want to focus on a lot, not just a stunning rise through Hollywood, but doing it really as a pioneer in an industry that incredibly, sort of oddly late in its history, was still a sort of foreign place to women in positions of responsibility and creativity. And I just want to welcome Nell Scovell.
Thank you. Yeah, it was, for a long time, there was like the Highlander theory of women where, there could be only one. And people would always assume like I knew Meryl Marco and I would say, well, we never worked together because they would keep us apart.
Yeah, because you could only have one. So how would you possibly meet each other?
No, I remember early in my very first TV job, one of the other writers, the show was canceled, and one of the other writers said to me, "You're so lucky. Every show is looking for a woman." And I said, "A woman and 10 men. How does that make me lucky?" I mean, it does if you're the one woman, but there are a lot of people who, for whatever reason, I was able to slide into these places. I wish there'd been more.
As I talked to you before the show, your biography is too large and varied to, we would need a mini-series to cover its many chapters. So I want to thematically go over the great career. But I think it's important that you came into Hollywood. You didn't just come in as an intern. You had had a career and you had accomplished major things before you came here. So tell me about the magazine world in the 1980s when you started this and coming up there. What was it? Writing Spy magazine, for those who don't know it, first of all, you should be ashamed of yourself. Second, was this sort of great humor magazine that was kind of funny and intelligent incisive, but also had real reporting in a way that you kind of can't imagine a magazine doing today. And what was it like? How did you come to join that? And what was it like writing for that those days?
Well, it was very snarky. In fact, David Denby wrote a book called Snark, and he actually talked about one of the articles that I'd written for Spy magazine, which was called Too Rich and Too Thin. And it was about all the society ladies who were extremely thin. This is before Tom Wolfe wrote about the social x-rays.
Yeah.
And I remember pitching the story to Kurt Andersen and him saying, well, you can try, but no woman wants to tell you her weight. And I said, oh no, these women are very proud. And I still remember this one socialite named Nan Kempner telling me that the last time she weighed herself, she was wearing nothing but a fur coat.
Nothing but a fur coat.
And she was 5'9" and weighed 110.
Most of it fur coat.
Yeah, most of it. So, and that was a big splash, and Page Six picked it up, and it was so great.
I mean, it was the kind of reporting, it kind of moved to the blogosphere, but without the intelligence and humor, sort of. It was kind of the snark minus the wit sort of became the internet.
Yes, and it. There was real reporting, and I feel very lucky because it was Graydon Carter and Kurt Andersen were the founders. They're both incredible writers themselves, and they really pushed me. They would say, be funnier, go harder, be meaner, and I think there's so much blandness now. And I'm really, it's kind of amazing that I did come up. And in fact, when I first started writing for TV, back in those days, you wrote a spec script, right? For an existing TV show to prove you could capture the characters. And the first one I did was for Gary Shandling's show. And in my memoir, Just the Funny Parts, I talk about just this incredibly strange situation where they bought it, which never happens. Now, they didn't in the end make it. And in fact, they hired me to write a second script, which they also didn't make. But my second spec script was for the show that Norman Steinberg was running out of New York, because I lived in New York and wanted to stay there. And I wrote a spec script for it and knew someone who knew him, got it to him. And he very kindly read about half the script, and then he stopped because he thought it was too mean. And so, fast forward a few years, I'm at home. I watched that first episode of The Simpsons that aired on Fox, and it was just this weird-ass cartoon. And I literally called my agent at home and said, I want to write for that show.
That is what is striking to me about your career going through it. That you constantly seem to be defying your agent and set out to exasperate him with the choices. And the first choice you make is leaving. You had a very prominent role in media. You were writing for Vanity Fair at a time when Vanity Fair was this was the golden age of the Roman orgy of New York media. And you decide to leave that to break into becoming an entry-level TV writer, and then you keep doing these things just because you think it would be a good experience, or because you think it would be fun, or someone you want to work with, instead of climbing a traditional ladder in any sensible way. Were you just trying to annoy your agent, or what was your thinking with it?
Well, I think because I was a woman, there were some roadblocks there for me. So I spent 2 years at Coach, actually did 2 and change at Coach. And ideally, I would have just stayed on that show and risen up the ladder. I don't think Craig T. Nelson was ever going to let a woman tell him what to do. So, I had to zigzag a lot. They say it's a jungle gym, not a ladder. But also, I think I had this other career of journalism to always fall back on, because I continued writing for magazines throughout my career because I was always sure TV would go away.
So a big part of your story I want to talk to you about is, and a big part of the history of Hollywood, the experience of what women went through breaking into the television industry, in particular into writing in Hollywood, is especially tough. But I think it was kind of masked and hidden by the idea that, this is a brutal business and it's hard for everybody. So yeah, you're in the worst corner of the death camp or whatever, but no one here is having fun. Did a lot get brushed under the rug? The experiences you describe on working in writers' rooms and working on TV shows just before the gender part sort of seemed nightmarish to start with to an outsider. I mean, the way people talk to each other, the hours, the competitiveness, what it takes to build in here, and then you have a whole nother layer of what it is to be a female in that experience.
Oh, well, I'm going to push back. I mean, it's not aspects were nightmarish, but your job is you're sitting in a room and everyone's job is to make other people laugh.
Your job is to make people laugh, but in a very critical, and I guess they're well paid. The takeout for lunch is good. You get to go to award shows. But the way your work is judged and people respond to it in a writer's room, I know from your stories and others, is incredibly brutal in a way that a delicate flower like myself would never survive a week of. You have to have a thick skin to be able to survive that.
Well, two things. One is that, I learned early on, you have to think about the next pitch, not the last pitch. And I do think that trips up a lot of people, maybe even mainly women, with that idea of you pitch something and it's a dud. And then you sit there going, I'm so stupid. Why did I pitch that? Well, and meanwhile, everyone else is thinking of the next pitch and you're focusing on the last one. I tried very hard not to do that. And then the second thing is, I really believe that the only way to move forward creatively is to allow yourself to be judged. So you're learning the show, and especially when you're at the lower levels. And what you want to see is the improvement. If the first month you're on a show, you only get one thing in a day, but then by the second week you're getting two, and then that's enough to keep. Well, it was enough to keep me going.
Interesting. So how does it feel in every situation you come into there? It seems like you are the first woman who has crossed this threshold. You're the only woman in the. Was it shocking? I mean, this was not 1936. This was.
I know it was the late 80s and 90s.
Yeah, and you came from a media world where there were plenty of women doing lots of things.
I mean, just to step back. So I think there's this notion that women aren't funny. And the question is why? There's got to be a reason for that because we know it's not true. It's because I think being funny is a valued social commodity. It's a desirable trait. And think about it too. It's like being wealthy and they say women aren't good at handling money, right? They're not funny. They're not good with money. That keeps them socially in their own little sphere. So I was just lucky that I grew up in a family. I had two really funny aunts. I was one of four girls. And my parents just never got the memo that said girls can't do what guys can do.
So when you step into these settings where you are the first or the only, what were your tricks to adapting and coping and getting along in these? You had a particularly stark experience on your first show there, the Smothers. The Smothers Brothers show that ended.
I was sexually assaulted by a head writer and
very marginalized leading up to that. There.
And I tell that story in my book because I think our culture has this tendency to see someone who's been successful and think, well, nothing bad ever happened to her. And I've had to go through all these horrible things. And she just sailed through. And, I didn't. And one of the reasons, so I did call my book Just the Funny Parts, is because I didn't want to dwell on a lot of the bad stuff, which is easy to do. I don't know if you got to the part in the book where I talk about my friendship with Irv Brecker. Irving
Yes.
Brecker,
Yeah.
who wrote two Marx Brothers movies. He created Life of Riley for the radio and then moved it to TV. I think you could argue he really helped invent the sitcom. And he shows up at the Aero Theater in Santa Monica. They're playing At the Circus and Go West, which are the two movies he wrote. And I went to see him. And first we watch At the Circus, then Irv comes on to do a Q&A. He opens with a line, he goes, my eyesight's not so good, but my wife tells me the marquee says, Irv Brecker live. That'll be a surprise to my doctors. So I just fell in love with the guy. And he proceeds to talk about At the Circus. You know, he says it's fun to listen to the crowd laugh. But then he launches into this sort of angry rant about how Mervyn LeRoy forced him to hire the man and woman who play the lovers, and they were no good, and he could have had Kitty Carlisle. And part of me was thinking, good for you. Hold on to that bitterness for 50 years. That's why you're still funny.
Yeah.
And then part of me was like, just let it go. Like, don't be mad at the casting on the 50th anniversary of the movie. Yeah, I mean, the bad stuff happened, but when I was writing the memoir, it did occur to me, like, ooh, I could settle scores. But then as you start writing, I started this chapter. I wrote a couple of movies with Joel Hodgson from Mystery Science Theater 3000,
Oh,
who's
great.
just
A great comedy icon.
one of my favorite people in the world. And I was just going to write a couple of pages and ended up just writing, a chapter about Joel and what a great guy he was. And I realized it's just, in fact, I had a T-shirt made that said, I'm writing a memoir and you're not in it. That the ultimate, payback would be not even to mention some of these people.
My plan. I think about what if I win the lottery one day. If I win $1 billion in the lottery, my plan is that I'm going to make a public announcement, go on TV, say if I've ever met you, anyone I've ever met, if I recognize you as a person I've ever seen before, come, I will give you $50,000, except for these 10 people. That's my plan. But you seem to, in these days when you were the first or the only, had remarkable success there overcoming that. What were your tricks or your ways to, besides being very good at what you do?
It's so trite to say, but a lot of hard work. Listening, you're writing for an audience. And I do think writing for various magazines, I'd been a sports writer at the Boston Globe my senior year in college. And I think I just understood that it wasn't about my voice. It was about capturing other people's voices. If you can get that in your head, then you can write both for, The Simpsons and NCIS, which I've done.
This episode is brought to you by AMC and AMC Plus, presenting Anne Rice's Interview with the Vampire, critically acclaimed with a 98% Rotten Tomatoes score, for your Emmy consideration in all categories, including Outstanding Drama Series. Episodes available to all Television Academy members at amcnfyc.com. In your experience, at that time, when a show would have 0 women on it, was that something anyone would ever say, oh, by the way, maybe we should think about that?
Yeah, I think people like having one. We were 50% of the population. It was good to have one of us in the room to say, hey, like I remember once in Coach me arguing that no woman would ever do something a female character was doing. And one of the co-EPs saying, well, my wife would do that. So they did it on the show. And by the way, the wife divorced the guy a few years later. Anyway, so I'm at Letterman on my first day, and one of the other writers comes by and he chats me up. And as he was leaving, he just stopped and said, before this is over, I will see a tampon fall out of your purse.
Which is the craziest thing to say on every level.
Well, we didn't have the word microaggressions back then. We didn't even have HR back then. I think it was just reminding me, they've done those studies where if you're giving boys and girls math tests, and on the first page you ask them, what is your gender? The girls do worse on the test.
Yeah.
Again, we're not good at math. We're not good with money.
Was that just a constant thing that you encounter every day and that you just have to?
The things that bothered me most were being excluded. And this was like, even as recently as, well, I guess 2015 wasn't that recent anymore. But I was on the Muppets and I was the only high level female. And the two male co-EPs and the male EP would go out to lunch and not invite me to go with them. And that was frustrating. And at one point, I finally worked up the nerve to go into the EP's office and say, you guys are friends. If you're just having fun, it's fine. But if you're talking about the show, you really should include me. And he shouted that, of course, they talked about the show, but I couldn't tell him who could come to lunch or not, and made him very uncomfortable by even mentioning it.
I mean, it's Hollywood and the way that it's organized. It is just such a weird place that because it's dealing with creative things, sort of seems like feels about itself like it has to be beyond any rules. Do you feel like today people are accepting that sort of normal codes of expectations of conduct maybe somehow enter into this world, or is that does it still just see itself as a world apart?
Well, let me ask you this.
Yes.
If I were a man, would you be grilling me about gender as much as you are now?
Well, if you'd written a book about the experiences, I think I would. And I think talking about your experience as a trailblazer, I think is relevant.
I mean, one thing I'm very proud of is, I created and was the showrunner of Sabrina the Teenage Witch.
Yeah.
I think this is a really good example of why you do want someone who's actually been a teenage girl to write those kind of shows. So at the same time, there was another witch show, and their pilot episode had to do with their teenage witch wants to use her magic to go to a sale at the mall of her favorite fashion store. With Sabrina, she did not care about clothes. She did not care about boys. She cared about being a good friend. She cared about she didn't want to be the weirdo at school, but she wouldn't be popular if it meant she had to be mean. She wanted to do well in her classes. I wrote one episode, and I wrote this one called Mars Attracts, and Chris Elliott actually was the guest star. He was hilarious.
Your list of guest stars on Sabrina, I hadn't even really. You had so many great talent, from Henry Gibson to Raquel Welch, and it's like 5 years of the Love Boat.
Well, when I finish this story, ask me about Bryan Cranston, because he was my favorite. Anyway, so Sabrina and her aunts go to Mars for a ski trip, and she meets a cute ski instructor, and they're having a picnic watching, shooting stars. And at one point he turns to her and says, "Can I kiss you?" So this is 96 when I wrote this. And I don't think people were talking about consent yet, but I was modeling consent for young girls. Just because I would want a guy to ask me. People will ask, was Sabrina feminist? And I was like, I don't know what the answer is, but I think it was thoughtful.
Yeah, it was certainly positive and uplifting. But tell me about your Bryan Cranston story.
Bryan Cranston, when I was on Coach, so do you remember Craig T. Nelson's character, Hayden Fox, was divorced? And he had in one episode, his ex-wife comes back with her new husband, and hilarity ensues. So they cast this guy as the ex-husband. He's fantastic at the table read. We go down on Wednesday to see the run-through, and this guy is brilliant, just getting tons of laughs. It's a joy to watch him. And we get back to the writer's room after the run-through. Barry Kemp, the showrunner, gets a call from Craig T. Nelson saying, "Fire that guy." So that guy was Bryan Cranston, who was just a genius. And so then a couple of years later, I'm running Sabrina, and we have this role of a witch lawyer. And I'm like, that guy was so funny. And I felt terrible because, who knows? Like, I'm sure his career just never amounted to anything. And this is pre Malcolm in the Middle. And I just said, offer him the part. He'll be great. And he was. He says something about wearing a 4-piece suit. And someone goes, well, I see your vest and your jacket, but where's the fourth piece? And he drops his trousers, and his boxers are made of the same material. So he was such a good sport, and he appreciated just getting a straight offer. And I don't know where he is today, but I predicted great things for that young man.
The last we ever heard of him.
Yeah.
One interesting piece, when you come to Sabrina, you talk about the 5 qualities of a great showrunner boss. And you talk about how writers kind of never learn how to manage people. Yeah. They learn how to manage characters and they learn how to manage stories, but they never learn how to manage people until one day, suddenly, they have to manage people. And talk to me about that transition and change and how you learn to step into that.
I mean, some people are just, natural leaders, but you're right. I mean, it isn't something a lot of people are taught.
Newsrooms in the day were, people would always say, what's the mood of the newsroom? And, even in the good times, the mood was always like, about ready to riot and revolt and burn the place to the ground. But I imagine in a writer's room, it's an even more intense relationship and more intense life. And I imagine that must get very fraught.
Yeah, I mean, so shows, I think, I break down into people, product, and process. And it's very rare that all 3 are a joy on any show. And the process is, the hours you're working. You could have a wonderful writer's room, but then the studio is constantly noting you. The people is, who you have to deal with every day, the actors. And then the product is, are you making something you're proud of? And, I had like Murphy Brown was just a delight. That was one where, you could be proud of every aspect. Sabrina was great. But for the most part, if you get 2 out of 3, you're lucky. And look, I did 2 years on Charmed, and it included Shannon Doherty's last year and Rose McGowan's first year.
If you had to choose, choose between we're going to do a show right now, it's going to be a nightmarish 6 months for you. This is going to be a worst 6 months, but what's going to come out of it is going to be the thing you are most amazed by and acclaimed and proud of your career. Or the next 6 months, this is the nicest group of people. You're going to work together so well. You're going to cooperate and get along. You'll be friends for the rest of your life, but it will get panned by all the critics and be canceled after 2 episodes. Which one would you choose?
So first of all, nobody's ever made a bad show in Hollywood. No writer has ever worked on a bad show. And it's always like, well, if you could read the scripts.
Yeah.
Second, I don't know, there's that Woody Allen short story where he's trying to take the brain of the smart woman and put it into the body of the pretty woman. And he finally figures out how to do it and then promptly falls in love with the ugly, stupid woman. I mean, I don't know.
If you read William Goldman's memoir,
so good,
which is sort of the great model of Hollywood writers' memoirs, every story was, I had a great idea for a script, I had this great thing, and then this idiot came along and ruined it. There's sort of the entire narrative there.
Well, one of my favorite stories is, so I was on NCIS for a season, and one day I got called into, Don Belisario was still on the show, the great man himself, and he called me into his office, and as I walked in, he threw a script at me, like literally just threw a script at my face. And he said, I need you to rewrite this. I said, how long? He said, well, we need it by Monday. I think it was a Friday. And I said, okay. And it was called Driven. And it was about a killer car that DARPA had invented that was murdering people. So I spent the weekend rewriting. I turned it in Monday. he was happy with the first two acts, not happy with the second. So he gave those to another writer to rewrite. Anyway, they shoot this Frankenstein script. All three of us writers end up with credits on it. And it's the only episode of TV I've ever written that was #1 in the ratings.
No. There you go.
For the week. I didn't tell anyone I'd written it. No. So I'm not sure I've even watched it.
So which do you choose in the end?
The first. I mean, you want to be proud of the work,
Yeah.
right? Although it doesn't really last. I mean, I think we trick ourselves into thinking that we're working on content that will live on for the ages, but I'm not sure.
Oh, you wrote about a lot of shows that are still.
Yeah.
Murphy Brown, I think, is still widely known.
Is it?
Is it?
Because that one's not in reruns at all, because people wouldn't get the Bob Dole jokes.
The Simpsons is still universally watched. I mean, David Letterman was a late night show, so it's not preserved in the same way, but in the history of television, I feel like a lot of these things will live on in one way or another for quite a while.
Right, but Jack Benny was as big a star as you could get. Does anyone under 60 know who Jack Benny is?
I see your point, but I think your work will live. So one other, if I get back to one other question about the female experience, and last one I promise, the thing about the women aren't funny narrative and the product that they are making, essentially roughly half the users of it will be female. So if, say, just take it for thought experiment that women aren't funny, well, you still have to appeal to those unfunny people and make them want to watch this thing. So having the perspective of people who relate, does that part of it ever come up in conversations?
I mean, it's so deep. And, I co-wrote Lean In with Sheryl Sandberg in part to try to just surface some of these deep cultural biases. And it's really hard. And I feel like we were making progress and we have slipped so far back as a country.
Do you feel like Hollywood has slipped back also?
Well, the numbers don't reveal much progress. It's incremental progress. And even if you look at the numbers, the percentages of women in writers' room is inching higher. But what I really want to see is the pie chart of how much women are earning versus how much men are earning. Because like when I was at the Muppets, there were like 6 women and 6 men, but the 6 women were all story editors and staff writers. I was the only upper level woman, and I'm sure I wasn't making as much as the 2 guys who had the same title as me.
Yeah.
So you really want not just numbers parity, but power parity.
Another issue you bring up, you had an astounding statistic that in the history of the David Letterman show, and I think this is not, you mentioned David Letterman, but probably this is more the norm than exception. There were 0 writers of color in the entire,
30 years.
That's astounding.
It's awful. It's embarrassing. Yeah.
And yet, to this day, there's 50 issues that I could name that we harp on here and all that, but getting Hollywood to change it remains like pulling teeth. I speak to you here in 2025, I believe it is. What makes things change in Hollywood?
It's a pervasive problem, so it's not just Hollywood. My father, it's his yard site tonight, so he's been on my mind, and he always used to say that the thing that made him the angriest was when people knew the right thing to do and they didn't do it. People I think they know the right thing to do, and they just need to do it.
There's so many things that nobody would argue about with you in Hollywood, and everyone would say, oh yeah, you're absolutely right. I think on most of the things we talked about, people would say you're absolutely right, and yet, but we have other things to deal with today.
But Hollywood isn't as liberal as people think it is.
In terms of personal behavior or in terms of how they vote or?
Yeah. I think there are a lot of rich white people who look out for their own interests. There are a lot of wonderful rich white people who are also very liberal, but it's there's diversity of thought and politics in Hollywood in a way that a lot of people don't acknowledge.
I would say the chasm between how people vote and how people act is pervasive.
I mean, when I was at Warehouse 13, we had this fantastic writer who was a story editor. He was just a star. He and I, like, we made each other laugh. He was really funny. And we ended up writing an episode together. It was like a season finale. And he has gone on to really great things and running shows. And I love it. He'll call me up and go, "Now, I just hired this kick-ass female director." And it made a difference, I think, that he bonded and saw what I could do. And just listening to me also complain about how it was harder for women. So we just need more people to be like Ian.
At this point in your career, what occupies your mind more, your great successes or the ones that got away?
I'll go back to my friend Irving Brecker. Met him at 92. We had 2 great years of friendships. He lived on the Wilshire corridor, where they don't call a cab, they call an ambulance. And I would visit him every Sunday. And he would pitch me ideas for sitcoms. There's a divorced couple, and the ex-husband, she remarries this rich guy, and they live in this luxury tower with her son. And he takes a job as a doorman so he can be closer to his son. It's not, and he goes, "We could get that young blonde to play the wife." I'm like, "Who?" And he goes, "Bette Midler." She was in her 60s at the time. Anyway, I was like, "Irv, that's a great idea." And he said, well, I can't write it alone anymore. My eyesight's not good enough. He goes, but would you write it with me? And I said, "Oh, Irv, I'd be honored to write with you." And he gets very wistful and he says, "I just want one more shot." He's 94. So again, I appreciate that and find it inspiring, but it also scares me because it's not what I've done, it's what I'll do.
That's how you've stayed great. I would have retired after your Simpsons script got on the air and said, "There's my tombstone right there."
Just sit at sushi bars and say "fugu me"
Exactly.
and really loudly until someone said, "Hey, is that from that Simpsons?" And then you go, "Yes, I wrote that."
That would have been a career well done right there. Very final question. This is always our final question. What is your advice to young Nell Scovell entering the industry today?
Don't be so defensive about notes. I think if you're insecure, you get angry about notes. And if you know more about the writing process, you're far more open to notes.
Is that the hardest thing for a writer to swallow?
Yeah. And there are very bad notes, but just notes in general. I would say that I'm much more open to them now. I like collaborating more now. It's less about, "But it's my vision," and more about, "Oh, okay, I thought I was communicating one thing, but that didn't come through, so I need to tweak it."
That is a great skill, to be open to that and open to collaborating. I never mastered that, and that's why I'm a reporter sitting alone, growling at my keyboard all day long. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's fascinating. This really was just an introduction to the life and thoughts and work of Nell Scovell, which, as I say, we could do a whole season and still just be scratching the surface. But I hope we'll talk again. It was great speaking with you.
Agreed.
And the book is Just the Funny Parts. It is still witty and fresh and funny today. And
can I tell you the title I wanted it to be?
No, yes, please.
Well, because we have been talking about gender and it is an important part of my life, but I really wanted the title to be Penis, 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 Me, Penis. I think it would have sold more, but
I think it would have gotten attention. But it's a great book. Please go buy it, and thank you so much for joining us.
You're welcome.
So that was our conversation with Nell Scovell, one of the coolest and funniest and most interesting people who has worked in Hollywood the past few decades, and I was thrilled to have a chance to talk to her. And I really recommend read her book, Just the Funny Parts. It holds up incredibly well, one of the best memoirs of working in television I've ever read. Thanks so much for joining us, and come back next week for another tale of television and our Hollywood stories.